Hi everyone, my name is Beth Griggs and I'm a senior software engineer at Red Hat. I gained my Red Hat just 4 months ago when I moved over from IBM, and I'm excited to be here virtually at Node Congress today. Today my talk is titled Node.js, New and Experimental Features. As part of my role at Red Hat, I help to maintain the Node.js runtime. I'm a Node.js Technical Steering Committee member and particularly active in the Node.js release working group. So I'm often spending my time determining the content of and producing the releases of the Node runtime. And today I want to spend some time talking about how new features get into the hands of Node.js users and why some features land as experimental first. Towards the end, I'll touch upon a few of the most recent experimental features in the newer versions of Node.js. Node.js is an impact project under the OpenJS Foundation. Formerly under the Node.js Foundation, but when that merged with the JS Foundation, it became the OpenJS Foundation. You may be surprised to learn that despite being under a foundation and having a technical steering committee, the Node.js project does not have a formal roadmap. There is no single corporate sponsor, it's decentralized, and generally the features and changes that get added to the runtime are a sum of the interests and requirements of our contributors. Typically, our users will only find out about new features when they are released. So finding out via the change logs or the release announcement posts after the release has happened. There's a distinct flow in which you can expect new features to arrive in Node.js releases. Node.js has a predictable release schedule. We have 2 major releases per year, with even numbers release lines being promoted to long-term support. And within that schedule, we have 3 defined release phases: current, active long-term support, and maintenance. Odd-numbered release lines will not go through the active LTS or maintenance phases, as they are not promoted to long-term support. And it's during the current phase where the release line will pick up most of the non-major and non-breaking changes that land on the Node.js core main branch. During the active LTS phase, only new features, bug fixes, and updates that have been audited by the LTS team to be appropriate and stable for the LTS release line will land. And then in maintenance, it will be restricted to only critical bug fixes and security updates. We rarely add new features to maintenance release lines. Sometimes we do, but that's very rare and only in the case where adding that feature supports users migrating to later release lines. So you can expect to pick up the newest features first in the current release line, which at the moment is Node.js 15. And typically for a current release line, you can expect a release every 2 weeks. After some time, you can expect new features to be backported to the LTS release lines, but not all features will be backported to LTS. Some will be considered unstable to do so, or perhaps the code delta in the release lines is too large to easily be able to bring that feature back. And if you're ever curious when the next release is, the release working group has issues in their GitHub repository containing draft schedules per release line. These are subject to change depending on releaser availability. Sometimes we have to accommodate ad hoc security releases, which can push the schedules out slightly. And generally, we won't schedule maintenance releases unless there are critical bug fixes to get out. And both the timeline on the previous slide and these issues can be found at github.com/nodejs/release. But how can you find out what's in the pipeline? Well, despite having no roadmap, there are still long-term efforts that you can follow to get an indication of what's coming next. We have working groups, teams, and strategic initiatives to dedicate to certain areas of the project. And these groups act as task forces to push forward certain subjects. For example, in the past, we had the modules effort focused on the ECMAScript modules implementation. You can follow the repository on GitHub, but you can expect to be overwhelmed by notifications there. It's hard to keep up. And the project's also recently kicked off the Next 10 effort, which is focused on defining our values and desires to guide the direction of the project in the next 10 years. You can also try following some of the active contributors on Twitter. Many are at this conference, so that's another good way of keeping up to date. So that's a bit about how features end up in releases. But how do you know when a feature is safe to use in your production applications? Well, Node.js provides a stability index. Throughout the API, there are indicators of stability. They go from stability 0, deprecated, 1, experimental, to stable. And generally, we advise people to stick to the stable features in their production applications. So going through each of these, for deprecated APIs, they can either be documentation or runtime deprecated. This is an example of documentation deprecation, and in particular, socket buffer size. And you can see it includes a deprecation ID and the version that introduced the deprecation. And documentation-only deprecations can land in minor releases. So they will not be restricted to majors. You may see them. And because documentation deprecations are just that, only written in the documentation, it can be difficult to know what is deprecated. Node.js does provide a pending deprecation flag. So some documentation-only deprecations will trigger a runtime warning when launched with this flag. So essentially, if you just want to run a check on your script or application, whether any of the APIs you're using are going to be deprecated in a future version, you could try running with this process flag, and it should tell you. In contrast, a runtime deprecation will, by default, generate a warning that's printed to standard error the first time the deprecated API is used. This is the unhandled promise rejection warning that may be familiar, and because this warning is an observable change and printed to standard error, you will generally only see these introduced into new major versions, as adding errors to standard error could break people's applications. There are further two process-related flags, the node deprecation and throw deprecation flags. The node deprecation flag silences deprecation warnings, but be cautious when using this because you're likely silencing a problem that you will need to fix later, as the deprecated API may eventually be removed. The throw deprecation will throw an error. On to experimental features. The Node.js Project Stability Index states that the experimental APIs may change behavior. The traditional Semver contract that we adhere to for stable APIs does not apply here, even in the long-term support release lines. And this is why we say to use experimental features with caution in production workloads, because the API service may change. And why do some features land as experimental and others do not? Well, in some cases, the most suitable API design may not be agreed upon up front, and we may want to get an early draft of the feature out to our users so they can give us feedback and we can evolve the API accordingly. Essentially, it's in cases where we don't want to lock the API in too soon. We have some whole core modules that are still designated as experimental. We have the async hooks core module, which provides an API to track asynchronous resources. And just this week, there are ongoing discussions around marking some of the APIs within this module as stable. We have the diagnostics channel module, which provides an API to create named channels to report message data for diagnostic purposes. And it's intended that a module writer wanting to report diagnostic messages will use this API to create many channels to report messages through. We also have the inspector core module that's still marked as experimental. And this module provides an API for interacting with the V8 inspector through Node. And we have the trace events module. And the trace events module provides a mechanism to centralize tracing information generated by V8, Node core, and even your own application code. And finally, we have the WebAssembly system interface core module, which is also experimental. And this provides an implementation of the WebAssembly system interface specification. And we have some specific experimental APIs. For example, many of the ECMAScript modules APIs are now marked stable, but a few of them are not. The ones that are still experimental include the loaders API, which is used to customize the default module resolution algorithm, top level await, which allows you to use await outside of an async function within an ECMAScript module, and JSON modules and WASM modules to support the loading of these. Policies are another experimental API. What are policies? Node.js contains experimental support for creating policies on loading code, and this is inspired by the browser's security mechanism to enforce resource integrity. Another experimental API is the source map support. So source maps provide a method for translating from generated source back to the original. And this is aimed to alleviate some of the observability challenges when using the alternative flavors of JavaScript. There's also the time as promises API. This was added in Node.js 15, and this provides a promise interface to timers rather than using the traditional callback interface. And then there's also the Web Crypto API, which exposes an implementation of the standard Web Crypto API. And you should catch James Snell's talk at this conference on that for some more information. And a number of these experimental features are hidden behind process flags, and this is to make them opt-in. So to actually start using some of these, you will need to start your process with one of these flags. For example, to start with the policy feature, you need to pass the experimental policy flag. And then we have some very experimental features that are hidden behind build time flags. To use these, you actually have to compile Node.js yourself from source. Why do we do this? Well, it's predominantly so that we can work on crafting very early implementations of a feature and build and test them in our continuous integration environment without them being released. If anyone would like to use any of these features, as I mentioned, you would need to build Node.js yourself from source, and information on how to do that can be found in the building MD file in the Node.js runtime repository. Finally, we have stable features. For stable features, semantic versioning applies. And with these features, you can have confidence that we'll try to keep to the API contract. You should only experience breaking API changes in stable features in the next major version. Compatibility is a priority, but there's one exception. If a security issue requires us to make a breaking API change, we may land this as Semver minor, but this is only done when absolutely necessary. So how and when do features get promoted to stable? Well, it's really when the contributors most involved in the feature have confidence in the API and don't believe that further changes are necessary. How can we get there quicker? Well, the more user feedback we receive on an experimental feature, the quicker we can gain confidence and consensus in the API structure. And note, not all features will ever make it out of experimental. Some have been in the state for several years, and some may end up being removed completely, never having made it out of experimental. This is, again, part of the reason why we suggest using experimental features with caution, because they may never fully become stable. And there are a number of new stable features in the latest release line. We have the abort controller, we have npm 7, and V8 8.6. And it's via V8 that we get the new JavaScript language features. For example, promise.any, aggregate error, string replace all, and the logical assignment operators all came in via V8 8.5. And that's what we're shipping in Node.js 15. So I'd like to encourage Node.js users to take a look at our experimental features, maybe try them out, and hopefully provide feedback on some of them. The more feedback we get, the more we can evolve the APIs depending on that feedback, or just gain confidence that the API structure is appropriate and then promote it to stable. I would say maybe don't rush to use experimental features in your critical applications or deployments just yet, because there's always the risk that things may break or be removed or changed. But yeah, definitely check out some of our experimental features, and we'd love to hear your feedback. And with that, I'd like to wish everyone an enjoyable rest of the conference, and I look forward to joining you all in the Q&A.